Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My world has a scent. It's a compound of vulcanized rubber, hot metal, and the clean, almost sweet smell of antifreeze. It is the honest, blue-collar perfume of a life spent making things work. My name is Declan, and for 20 years, my hands have been my language. I am an auto mechanic. I diagnose the secret, ailing whispers of an engine. I understand the precise, unforgiving logic of a transmission. I can feel a flaw in a car's alignment through the soles of my feet. It is a solid, tangible, and deeply satisfying world. I am a man who believes in fixing things that are broken. For the first 10 years of our marriage, I believed my life with Isla was the one thing that was not and would never be broken. She was a different element. Where my world was grease and steel, hers was books and light. When we met, she was a waitress with a poet's soul, a woman who seemed to carry a library of dreams behind her bright, intelligent eyes. I was a young mechanic, still learning my trade, a man whose dreams were simpler: a small house, a steady job, a life with this woman who seemed to see something in me that I didn't see in myself. Our love was a beautiful, improbable bridge between two different worlds. She was my escape from the loud, grinding reality of the workshop, and I was her anchor, the solid, dependable ground beneath her soaring, ambitious spirit. The dream of her education was hers, but the work of building it became ours. She wanted to be a lawyer. It was a dream so vast, so far removed from the world of community college and waitressing tips that it seemed like a distant, glittering star. But I believed in her. I saw the sharp, brilliant mind behind her tired, end-of-shift smile. And I made a decision, a simple mechanic's decision. I would be the engine that powered her journey. I took on a second job, working nights as a security guard, a silent, ghost-like figure patrolling empty office buildings. I worked weekends, rebuilding classic cars for a small, niche clientele. My life became a blur of work, of exhaustion, of the constant metallic taste of cheap coffee. I was a machine, converting my own time, my own youth, my own life force into the tuition payments and the living expenses that would allow her to fly. And it was the happiest, most purposeful time of my life. I was not just fixing cars, I was building a future. Her future. Our future. I would come home in the dead of night, smelling of oil and sweat, and I would find her asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by a fortress of thick, intimidating law books. I would gently carry her to bed, a sleeping warrior. And I would feel a sense of pride so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. We were a team, a partnership. We were building something beautiful and difficult and real. She graduated with honors. I sat in the back of the grand, sun-filled auditorium, a grease-stained ghost in a borrowed suit, and I wept. I watched her walk across that stage, my beautiful, brilliant wife, and I felt like I had just watched a ship I had built with my own bare hands finally and magnificently set sail. The life that followed was a different country. She got a job at a prestigious downtown law firm, a world of glass and steel and quiet, lethal ambition. Our small, cluttered apartment was replaced by a sleek, minimalist condo in a high-rise building, a place that always felt a little too quiet, a little too clean. My second job was no longer necessary. My single mechanic salary was now a quaint, almost embarrassing footnote in our new, high-powered financial reality. I was proud of her. I was in awe of her. But a new, subtle, and deeply unsettling distance began to grow between us. Our worlds, which had once been so different but so deeply connected by a shared purpose, were now drifting apart. The language of her new life was one I did not understand. She would talk of mergers and acquisitions, of torts and depositions. Her new friends were other lawyers, sharp, witty, and ambitious people who wore expensive suits and talked about their stock portfolios. I would stand in a circle with them at her corporate functions, a silent, awkward man in a clean shirt that still smelled faintly of the garage. And I would feel like a foreigner, a tourist with a bad phrase book. I was the simple, honest, and increasingly out-of-place foundation upon which her glittering new skyscraper had been built. She was always loving, always grateful. She would call me her rock, her secret weapon. She would tell her new sophisticated friends the story of my sacrifice, and they would look at me with the kind of polite, anthropological curiosity, as if I were a rare and slightly tragic artifact from a simpler time. "Declan is the most genuine man I have ever known," she would say, and she would squeeze my hand. But her hand, which had once fit so perfectly in my own, now felt different. It was smoother, softer, the hands of a woman who no longer had to work. And my hands, with their permanent, ingrained grime and their calloused, broken knuckles, felt rough and crude and unworthy of her touch. I told myself it was just an adjustment period, a natural consequence of our changing fortunes. I was still the man she came home to. I was still her husband. The foundation was still solid. The cracks, when they began to appear, were almost invisible. A late night at the office that would stretch until midnight. A work retreat on a weekend that I was not invited to. Her phone, which had once been a shared open book, now had a password and was always, always screened down on the table. They were small things, plausible things. The life of a young, ambitious lawyer was a demanding one. I was a man who understood the mechanics of a system. And the system of our marriage, I began to realize, was developing a subtle but persistent misfire. The noise, the beautiful, chaotic noise of our early years, had been replaced by a quiet, efficient hum. But beneath that hum, there was a new sound, a faint, almost inaudible ticking. The sound of a clock, counting down to a moment I did not and could not allow myself to imagine. The moment when the engine I had so lovingly and so selfishly helped to build would finally and completely leave me behind. The ticking grew louder. It was a sound that existed only in my own head, a quiet, persistent, and deeply paranoid metronome, marking the time of my own slow-motion obsolescence. On the surface, our life was a portrait of success. Isla was a rising star at her firm, a brilliant and tireless associate who was earning the respect of her powerful and mostly male superiors. Our condo was beautiful. Our finances were, for the first time in our lives, not just stable, but flourishing. I had quit my night job as a security guard, and my own small garage was doing well, a boutique business that catered to a niche of classic car enthusiasts. We were a success story, the kind of story they write about in magazines. The story of the working-class boy and the brilliant girl who, together, had conquered the world. But the story I knew was a fiction. The truth was far quieter and far more complex. The distance between us was no longer just a matter of social class. It was becoming a vast and increasingly unnavigable emotional gulf. We were living in the same beautiful, minimalist space, but we were inhabiting different planets. Her planet was one of billable hours, of corporate intrigue, of late-night strategy sessions with her colleagues. My planet was one of carburetors, of timing belts, of the quiet, satisfying logic of a perfectly tuned engine. We were speaking different languages, and we were both, I think, too tired and too proud to hire a translator. The central figure in her new world, the sun around which her professional planet seemed to orbit, was a man named Julian Croft. He was a senior partner at the firm, a legal titan, a man whose name was a synonym for power and influence in the city. He was her mentor, her champion, her greatest advocate. And he was, from Isla's breathless descriptions, a figure of almost mythical proportions. He was brilliant, he was ruthless. He was a man who had not just built a career, but an empire. "Julian is taking me on the M&A case for the Harrison merger," she would tell me, her eyes shining with an ambition that was both beautiful and a little bit terrifying. "It's the biggest deal in the firm's history. He says he sees a younger version of himself in me." I was supposed to be proud, and I was. But I was also, in a small, dark, and deeply insecure corner of my heart, beginning to feel a cold, unfamiliar dread. I was a mechanic. I fixed things. Julian Croft was a man who built empires. How could I, a man who worked with his hands, compete with a man who moved the world with his words? I had helped her build her engine, but he was the one who was now teaching her how to drive it on a faster, more dangerous, and far more exciting track than I could ever provide. The evidence of my own slow and steady replacement was a series of small, almost insignificant details. It was in the new, expensive brand of coffee that appeared in our kitchen, a brand I knew Julian favored because she had mentioned it once. It was in the way she began to quote him, to use his phrases, his particular cynical brand of legal humor. It was in the way her laughter, when she was on the phone with him, a frequent and increasingly late-night occurrence, was a different kind of laughter than the one she used with me. It was a brighter, sharper, and more alive sound. I was a man who was trained to listen for the subtle, telltale signs of a failing system, and the system of my marriage was making all the wrong noises. It was running rough. There was a knocking in the engine that I could not diagnose, a vibration in the chassis that I could not locate. The final, catastrophic engine failure happened not with a loud, violent explosion, but with a quiet, almost casual conversation. It was a Saturday, a rare and precious day that she was not at the office. I was trying to rebuild. I had made a reservation at a small, romantic restaurant, the kind of place we used to go to in the early, hungry years of our marriage. I was trying to be the man I used to be, the man who was not just a quiet, grease-stained fixture in the background of her brilliant new life. She came into the living room dressed not for a date, but for a board meeting, a severe, elegant, and breathtakingly expensive suit. "I'm so sorry, Deck," she said, her voice a perfect, smooth blend of apology and regret. "I can't. Julian just called. There's been a crisis with the Harrison deal. We have to go to the office. All hands on deck. It's a make-or-break weekend." I looked at her, at my beautiful, brilliant, and suddenly completely unrecognizable wife. And I knew with the calm, quiet, and utterly devastating certainty of a master mechanic diagnosing a fatal internal flaw that she was lying. It was not in her words. The words were perfect, plausible. It was in the tale, the same small tale I had seen in 1,000 customers trying to lie to me about why their engine had seized. A slight, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her left eye. A tiny, involuntary muscle spasm that only happened when she was telling a direct and significant lie. I had seen it 100 times over the years, when she would tell me a little white lie about a new dress or a fib about a minor fender bender. I had always found it endearing, a charming human flaw in her otherwise perfect composure. Now I saw it for what it was, a signal, a warning light on the dashboard of my marriage. And it was blinking a frantic, undeniable, and catastrophic red. "Okay," I said, my own voice a marvel of calm control. The mechanic in me, the man who knows you never, ever show your hand until you have all the data, took over. "No problem. You have to do what you have to do. The deal is the most important thing." "Thank you for understanding," she said, her relief palpable. She came and kissed me on the cheek. Her lips were cool. "I'll make it up to you, I promise." She left. The scent of her expensive corporate perfume hung in the air, a foreign, invasive species in the quiet, familiar territory of our home. I sat there, on the sofa, for a very long time. The man who had been a loving husband was gone. In his place was a cold, quiet, and deeply focused diagnostician. I had the symptom, the lie. Now I had to find the cause. I did not call her, I did not text her, I did not engage in the emotional amateur theatrics in a jealous husband. I began a quiet, methodical, and deeply logical investigation. My first step was simple. I called the main switchboard of her law firm. I asked the weekend operator to connect me to Julian Croft's office. "I'm sorry, sir," the operator said, her voice bored and professional. "Mr. Croft is not in the office this weekend. He's out of town. Can I take a message?" Out of town. The lie was not just that she was going to the office, the lie was that he was too. They were not at the office. They were somewhere else, together. The next step was to find out where. I was not a computer expert, but I was a man who understood systems. And I knew that in the digital age, every system has a black box, a record of its last known movements. I went to our home computer. I opened her browser history, and I began to sift through the digital wreckage of her life, looking for the coordinates of her betrayal. I found it in the deleted items folder of her email, a confirmation from a small boutique hotel in the wine country a few hours' drive away, a 2-night booking, a suite with a fireplace and a private balcony. The reservation was in his name, Julian Croft, and the dates were for this weekend. The weekend of the make-or-break crisis with the Harrison deal. The weekend she was supposed to be having a romantic dinner with me. I sat there in the quiet, empty condo, surrounded by the beautiful, minimalist furniture she had chosen, and I felt the entire, carefully constructed building begin to shake on its foundations. The ticking in my head had stopped. It had been replaced by a new sound. The sound of a slow, grinding, and inexorable structural failure. I was a man who had built a powerful, beautiful engine, and I had just discovered that it had been taken and installed in another man's car. The knowledge of the hotel reservation was a quiet, cold, and heavy object in the center of my life. For 3 days, while she was away on her work retreat, I lived with it. I went to my garage. I worked on a vintage Porsche 911 I was restoring. The familiar, logical process of dismantling and reassembling the engine was a kind of therapy, a way to impose a small mechanical order on the vast emotional chaos that was consuming me. I was a surgeon, performing a delicate and ultimately pointless operation on a beautiful, dead machine, while my own living heart was slowly and quietly seizing up. I did not feel rage. The betrayal was too profound, too systemic for a simple hot emotion like anger. What I felt was a kind of deep structural sorrow. I was an engineer, a builder, a man who had dedicated his life to the principles of sound construction. And I had just discovered that the most important structure I had ever built, my marriage, was a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies, and a single gust of wind was all that was needed to bring the entire beautiful and fragile thing down. I had to decide if I was going to be that gust of wind. The easy path, the path of righteous, masculine anger, was to drive to that hotel, to confront them, to create a scene of ugly, satisfying, and ultimately destructive drama. But I was not that man. My work had taught me patience, the value of a slow, methodical, and deeply considered approach. You do not fix a complex, failing engine by hitting it with a hammer. You diagnose, you analyze, and you formulate a plan. My plan, when it began to form, was a quiet and, in its own way, a deeply cruel one. I would not give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. I would not give her a drama to perform in, a stage on which she could play the part of the tearful, repentant, but ultimately tragically romantic heroine. I would not give her a storm. I would give her a quiet, creeping, and deeply unsettling fog. I would let her own guilty conscience and the quiet, unnerving pressure of my knowledge do the work for me. She returned on Sunday evening, her face flushed with the country air and a barely concealed triumphant joy. She was a woman who had just successfully and thrillingly lived her double life. She brought me a gift, a bottle of expensive wine from a local vineyard, a peace offering, a souvenir from the scene of her crime. "I missed you," she said, her kiss a light, cool, and utterly false gesture. "It was a brutal weekend, but I think we saved the deal." "I'm glad," I said, my voice a marvel of calm, loving support. "You must be exhausted." I was the perfect, understanding, and completely cuckolded husband. The first part of my plan was to alter the landscape of our home. I did not remove her things. I began, slowly and methodically, to reintroduce my own. The sleek, minimalist condo she had designed had always felt like her space, a beautiful but sterile showroom in which I was a slightly awkward and often out-of-place accessory. That week, I began to bring my world into hers. I brought home a beautiful, old, and massive workbench I had salvaged from a closing workshop. I placed it against the main wall of our open-plan living room. It was a beautiful piece of industrial art, its surface scarred with the history of 100 years of honest work. It was also a massive and completely undeniable statement of my own presence. I began to work on small, intricate engine parts at that bench in the evenings, the clean, metallic scent of my world slowly but surely beginning to overwhelm the faint floral scent of hers. She watched this quiet, territorial invasion with a growing and unspoken unease. "What is all this, Declan?" she asked one evening, her gesture encompassing the disassembled carburetor parts that were laid out like surgical instruments on the pristine surface of my new bench. "I just thought I'd bring a little of my work home," I said, my voice a calm, simple statement of fact. This place was starting to feel a little impersonal. The second part of the plan was to introduce a new and deeply unsettling variable into her own carefully curated world. I knew from her endless stories that Julian Croft was a man who was obsessed with his own public image. He was a collector of art, of antique cars, of the kind of beautiful, expensive, and masculine things that signal wealth and power. I began my own quiet and deeply focused education. I read art history books. I subscribed to classic car magazines. I studied the auction catalogs from Sotheby's and Christie's. I was learning to speak his language. One evening, as she was on the phone with him, her voice a low, intimate murmur from the other room, I did something I had never done. I picked up the extension. I did not speak. I just listened. They were talking about a painting by a contemporary artist she admired. "I'm just not sure, Julian," she was saying. "The provenance is a little weak." I waited for a pause, and then I spoke. A single, quiet, and perfectly timed comment into the silence of their private conversation. "The artist's blue period is widely considered to be a forgery anyway," I said, my voice the calm, authoritative tone of a man who knows exactly what he is talking about. The silence on the other end of the line was a beautiful and deeply satisfying thing. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. I could almost hear the frantic, confused gears turning in Julian's powerful legal mind. Who was this? This man who was not only listening to their private call, but who was also, it seemed, a knowledgeable and confident critic of the very world that he, Julian, was the master of. I quietly hung up the phone. A few minutes later, Isla came into the room, her face pale. Were you just on the phone?" she asked, her voice a thin, tight wire. "The connection was bad," I said, my face a mask of innocent confusion. "I thought I heard a voice. Did you say something about a forgery?" I was no longer the simple, grease-stained mechanic. I was a ghost in her machine. A quiet, knowledgeable, and deeply unsettling presence in the heart of her secret, sophisticated world. The final part of the plan was the most direct and the most cruel. It was the unveiling of the board. I had been working on a secret project in my garage for months. It was a gift for her, a surprise. I had been building a visualization board for our future, a physical manifestation of the dreams I thought we had shared. I had spent 100 hours on it, crafting a beautiful, intricate frame of reclaimed wood. The board itself was a large cork panel. I told her I wanted to show it to her on a specific date, the 1-year anniversary of the day she had become a partner at her firm, a day that was, I now knew, also the anniversary of the beginning of her affair with Julian. I brought the board into the living room. It was covered with a velvet cloth. She stood before it, her eyes full of a mixture of curiosity and a deep, apprehensive dread. She knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in our house for the past month had been a quiet, psychological Cold War. She knew she was losing. She just didn't know how. "I wanted to create a picture of our future, Isla," I said, my voice soft. "A map of the road ahead, for us." And I pulled the cloth away. The board was not a collection of dreams, it was an indictment. It was a perfectly composed and brutally organized collage of the evidence of her lie. In the center was a large, glossy satellite image of the hotel in the wine country. Radiating out from it were the other pieces of my quiet investigation. A printout of the hotel reservation in his name. A copy of our phone records showing her calls to him late at night for months. A timeline, which I had painstakingly created, that cross-referenced her work retreats and late nights at the office with his own known travel schedule. And in the bottom right corner, a single, small, and beautifully framed photograph. A picture of her, taken on our wedding day. Her face a mask of what I had once believed was pure, unadulterated love. I did not say a word. I did not need to. The board was a silent, eloquent, and utterly damning closing argument. I had taken her own corporate tool, the visualization board, and I had used it to visualize the truth. She stared at it, her face crumbling, the beautiful, confident mask of the successful lawyer dissolving into the face of a small, terrified, and utterly exposed child. "Declan," she whispered, the word a plea, a prayer, a surrender. I did not answer. I simply turned and I walked to my new, beautiful workbench in the center of the room. I picked up a small, delicate, and perfectly balanced ball-peen hammer, and I went back to my work, the quiet, rhythmic, and deeply satisfying tap-tap-tapping of the hammer on a piece of hot, pliant metal, the only sound in the silent, ruined, and finally honest room. The silence that followed the unveiling of the board was a new kind of silence. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret being kept. It was the clean, quiet, and echoing silence of a tomb that has just been unsealed. The ghost of our marriage, the lie we had both in our own ways been living, was now out in the open, and the air in the room, while cold, was finally, blessedly clear. Isla did not rage. She did not weep. She simply collapsed. It was not a physical collapse, but a spiritual one. The intricate, high-powered, and beautifully constructed engine of her ambition, of her double life, had seized. She sat on the expensive, minimalist sofa she had chosen, and she stared at the board, at the quiet, irrefutable evidence of her own long-running betrayal. And she was a statue of a woman, frozen in the moment of her own quiet and catastrophic reckoning. I continued my work at the bench. The small, rhythmic sounds of my tools, the scrape of a file, the tap of a hammer, were the only sounds in the room. I was not ignoring her. I was giving her the one thing she had never given me, the truth of my own separate existence. I was no longer an accessory to her life. I was the protagonist of my own. And my story, it was now clear, was being written not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but here, in the honest, tangible world of my own two hands. She left the next morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when she came out of the bedroom, carrying a single small suitcase. Her face was pale, her eyes were red-rimmed, but she was composed. She was a lawyer again, a woman handling the quiet, sad, and necessary logistics of a dissolved partnership. She did not offer an explanation. She did not ask for forgiveness. She knew, as I knew, that we were far beyond the shallow waters of apologies. "The condo is yours," she said, her voice a flat, dead thing. "My name is on the lease, but I will sign it over. The furniture, you can sell it. I don't want any of it." She placed a key on the kitchen counter. Her key. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours," she said. And then she paused, her hand on the doorknob. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a liar, not a betrayer, but a woman who was profoundly and completely lost. "He was just a symptom, you know," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Not the disease. The disease was me.
I wanted to be a person who lived in a world like this, and I became her. I just, I forgot to bring you with me. And then she was gone. The door closed with a soft, final click, and I was alone. Alone in the beautiful, silent, and now completely empty condo. Alone with a future that was a blank and terrifying and exhilaratingly empty page. The months that followed were a quiet and deeply necessary deconstruction. I hired a lawyer, and the divorce was a simple, clean, and uncontested process. I sold the condo. I sold the sleek minimalist furniture. I systematically, and with a strange, liberating joy, dismantled the entire beautiful stage set of the life that had never really been mine. I took the money, a significant sum, and I did something that the old Declan, the sensible, cautious Declan, would have never done. I bought a building. An old, derelict, and beautiful brick warehouse in a forgotten industrial part of the city. A building with good bones, a solid foundation, and a soul that had been neglected for 50 years. It was a ruin. It was perfect. It was me. My new life began in that building. I lived in a small makeshift apartment in the back, and the vast open space of the warehouse became my workshop, my studio, my sanctuary. I began to build again. Not just small, intricate engine parts. I began to build furniture. My furniture. Pieces that were a reflection not of a client's taste or of a market trend, but of my own quiet and deeply felt aesthetic. The work was a fusion of the two worlds I had inhabited. It was the warm, honest, and timeless beauty of handcrafted wood, combined with the cold, elegant, and powerful logic of industrial steel. It was a style that was entirely my own. I did not start a company. I did not create a brand. I just worked. And the world, in its own slow and mysterious way, began to find me. A local gallery owner saw my work. An architect stumbled upon my quiet industrial corner of the city. My pieces, the ones that were born from the ashes of my old life, began to find their way into the world. They were not just furniture. They were stories. Stories of resilience, of the beauty of imperfection, of the strength that can be found in the clean, honest marriage of different and seemingly incompatible materials. I did not know what had become of Isla. I did not know if she had found happiness or just a different, more glittering kind of emptiness with Julian Croft. Her story was no longer my concern. I was too busy writing my own. One day, about a year after she had left, a letter arrived at my workshop. There was no return address. The handwriting was hers. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was not a cry for help. It was a single, small, and beautifully printed photograph. It was a picture of a single, elegant, and vaguely familiar chair, sitting in the corner of a bright, sunlit room. It was one of mine. A chair I had sold to the gallery a few months earlier. She had bought it, anonymously. At the bottom of the photograph, she had written a single, short sentence. "You were always the better builder." I looked at the photograph for a long time, and I felt not a flicker of the old, familiar pain. I felt only a quiet and deeply peaceful sense of balance. The ledger was closed. The accounts were settled. She had her story, and I, at long last, had mine. And it was a story that was, I now knew, built of a material that was strong enough and honest enough and beautiful enough to last. Before you go, I have to ask, what was the moment someone's mask fell off in your life? Share it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers for more jaw-dropping true stories.